Our Old Testament reading for today, as is the practice during the season of Easter, is from the book of Acts. Acts tells the story of the continuing life of the people of God as the church now becomes that people. Following Pentecost, with the people being filled with the Spirit, they formed this peculiar community that people couldn't help but notice. And in today's reading, we hear just a brief bit of the message of that community. Listen then for what the Spirit is saying to today's church. Now the whole group of those who believed were of one heart and soul, and no one claimed private ownership of any possessions, but everything they owned was held in common. With great power, the apostles gave their testimony to the resurrection of the Lord Jesus, and great grace was upon them all. There was not a needy person among them, for as many as owned lands or houses sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold. They laid it at the apostles' feet, and it was distributed to each as any had need. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Did you know that it is still Easter? A lot of people think of Easter as a day, but on the Christian calendar, Easter is a season. It began last Sunday and it runs up until Pentecost. And for that matter, every Sunday is Easter. It is the Lord's Day, the day of resurrection. But still, last Sunday was the Sunday for big crowds, the Sunday for shouting, "Christ is risen, He is risen indeed." Last Sunday was the Sunday for brass and for singing, "Jesus Christ is risen today." Regardless of Easter being a season, of each Sunday being its own little Easter, it certainly makes sense to go all out on one particular day. We can't very well have brass and Easter lilies every single Sunday. And I take it that that's the only reason why we don't do Easter big time every single Sunday. It would be too much trouble. It's certainly not because the Easter news is so difficult for us to believe that we do not want to be confronted with it every single week. I mean, most Christians that I know seem to have no trouble at all believing the Easter news. But that certainly was not always the case. When the women first return from the empty tomb and tell the disciples their story, they are discounted and dismissed. Luke's gospel says that the disciples considered it an idle tale, and they did not believe them. And even when the risen Jesus has appeared to many of the disciples, Thomas still just can't believe it. But the shock of the stunning news of resurrection wore off many years ago. We now can say Jesus is risen as easily as we say the sky is blue. Perhaps this is because our faith is so strong, because it has been confirmed for us over the events of our lives. But perhaps it is, at least in part, because we don't quite realize what a radical thing it is to say, Christ is risen. Think about it. If you headed out one Monday to visit the grave of a friend and came back a few hours later screaming that the grave's empty and my friend is alive, then we would like you to have a meeting with the nice doctors. And yet we go around saying that about Jesus as if it were nothing at all. And I worry that this is so in part because the story of Jesus' resurrection has gotten disconnected from its biblical roots and gotten joined to a vague notion of life after death. We speak easily of resurrection at a funeral, as if resurrection were almost a natural part of the dying process. But that is not what Easter is about. Resurrection is not a next step, something that occurs naturally. Resurrection is the impossible, something only God could do, something that is a part of God's coming kingdom. And so if Jesus is indeed risen, then the impossible has happened. God has acted in a new and decisive way, and God's promised reign has broken in to this age. That's what our reading from the book of Acts is about. According to Acts, immediately following Pentecost, the church becomes this remarkable community. All who believed were of one heart and soul. Really? Clearly, Luke had never been to a Presbyterian meeting. Clearly, Luke had never seen the bitter divisions there. The distrust that those on the left have for those on the right, and those on the right have for those on the left. Of one heart and soul, it's hard to find that in the tiniest little congregation, much less in the church. And no one claimed private ownership of any possessions, but everything they owned was held in common. There was not a needy person among them, for as many had lands or houses, sold them and brought the proceeds of what was sold. Right. Now I know Luke was smoking something when he wrote the book of Acts. You know anybody that's in a church like that? Would you believe someone, a friend, if she told you she belonged to a church like that? We hear the Easter story, and rarely does anyone object about it to me. Rarely does anyone say to me, we're not really supposed to take that literally. But most any time I've taught a Bible study on this reading from Acts, or have used it as a devotional at a governing board meeting or a committee meeting, someone has raised a question. Someone has said, this is symbolic, not literal. This doesn't really apply to us. But for the writer of Acts, this story is all about resurrection.